Delmarva Today with Don Rush.
The country may be set to get its first African-American woman on the U.S. Supreme Court. Welcome to Delmarva Today. This is Don Rush. With the retirement of Supreme Court Justice Stephen Breyer, the way has been opened after President Biden's campaign promise to put a black woman on the bench. Currently, there are three women, Sonia Sotomayor and Elena Kagan on the liberal side and Amy Coney Barrett on the conservative side. If confirmed, the new justice will most likely join the two liberals, facing off against the six conservatives on the court. We're now joined this morning by Hannah Brenner Johnson, and co-author of the book Shortlisted, Women in the Shadows of the Supreme Court. Welcome to the program.
Thank you so much.
So I want to start, by the way, before we get into the nomination here, of a story that I think you guys covered as well in the book, which was about Richard Nixon, who apparently considered appointing Mildred Lilly to the bench, but got opposition, obviously, from Warren Berger, and, of course, the ABA steps in. Tell me then a little bit about that, because that hasn't been that long ago.
That's right. So in the 1970s, President Nixon, perhaps motivated by politics, like many presidents before and after him, talked publicly about putting a woman on the Supreme Court. In fact, there were two women who he officially shortlisted. Mildred Lilly is one, a judge from California, as well as Sophia Bacon. And, both women, I think, were used, effectively as tokens or political pawns. Nixon was very strategic in that way. Privately, he confided to his advisors in the White House that he didn't think women should be allowed to vote, much less sit on the court. So it was largely a political ploy. But in fact, opened the door for my co-author and I to discover that, in fact, there had been many women, 9, in fact, who had been shortlisted back to the 1930s, before Sandra Day O'Connor became the first woman to actually sit on the court in 1981.
And one of the things that the story seems to highlight is the fact that there was this really strong opposition. I mean, you had, I guess, the threat of Warren Berger perhaps resigning. The ABA steps in, of course, and takes care of everything. But, I mean, there's this strong sentiment that women shouldn't be on the courts, particularly the high court, or even lawyers for that matter.
Absolutely. So the American Bar Association's move was really a powerful one. Their standing committee on the judiciary is often consulted by presidents to vet their potential nominees. Of course, the ABA, being the largest lawyers affinity organization in this country, is quite a powerhouse. And that committee, that standing committee on the judiciary, declared that Mildred Lilly was unqualified to sit on the U.S. Supreme Court. Now, years later, former White House counsel John Dean took a look at Mildred Lilly's qualifications and stacked them up against Sandra Day O'Connor, and found that, if anything, Lilly was probably even more qualified than O'Connor. And yet, we expect that, or suspect that it was very, not just implicit, but explicit gender bias that kept her from advancing serious consideration at that time.
So what do you make then of the current debate now around an African-American woman being appointed to the bench? If indeed she is appointed and confirmed, there'll be actually 4 women actually on the bench. What do you make of that?
Well, I think for some people, this may seem unprecedented. President Biden campaigned on this promise, in fact, that if given the opportunity, he would put a black woman on the court. But, in fact, President Reagan was one who first made this promise. He campaigned on the same kind of promise, saying that if he was, elected president and faced a vacancy on the Supreme Court, that he would put a woman in that spot. Of course, from Reagan's perspective, he was referring to a white woman. There had never been a woman in that role, and so that was a step in the right direction. And Reagan, in fact, delivered on that promise. He gave us Sandra Day O'Connor. But also was, highly politically motivated. I think there are some differences between what happened, in the 80s and today with President Biden's promise. President Reagan didn't continue his trajectory of making the bench more diverse. In fact, O'Connor was really one of the only diverse judges that he appointed during his time in office. And President Biden already, before this vacancy arose, has really worked hard to diversify the court, both in terms of gender and race. And so I think, this is a significant point in time. The Supreme Court has been, largely populated by white men. Now, of course, we will potentially have 4 women sitting on the court at the same time. But the court has not been diverse insofar as reflecting the public that it ultimately serves. And so this would be an important step forward.
Now, one of the things that struck me is that in terms of black women, they represent only about maybe 2% of the 1.3 million lawyers in the country. I think there are nearly 1,400 federal judges, including active and quasi-retired. Of those, only 56 are black women, or about 4% if you include those who are multiracial. How important are these judgeships, and particularly the appellate court, in terms of getting someone on the bench like this?
So certainly the federal appellate courts are one important pipeline to the Supreme Court. And when you look back historically, in recent decades, at the dearth of women of color who have been appointed into those roles, the pipeline may seem smaller than it ultimately could be. But not all Supreme Court justices come from the federal appellate bench. A number of justices on the Supreme Court have had no judicial experience. Or very little. Back in time, there were several justices who actually never went to law school. And so, there are a lot of paths to the court, but certainly the federal bench is an important pipeline. And so diversifying that group, that pool of judges, is equally important because we know that is, the pool from which individuals are picked for honors like sitting on the U.S. Supreme Court. But I hear a lot in the conversations that I've been having in recent days about, the very small percentage of black women in the legal profession, on the bench, as if somehow that is, disqualifying to, or should somehow, go against President Biden's commitment to put a black woman on the bench. I think the better inquiry or the better frame to consider this question is against the population of this country. And the Supreme Court should, in fact, be a diverse representation of the public that it ultimately serves. And the legal profession is a piece of that public, but certainly not the entire, does not represent the spectrum of the entire country. I think it's also important to note that there have been really explicit barriers that have prevented women's advancement and women of all races and ethnicities and backgrounds into the legal profession. Progress has been slow, and so it's not surprising, perhaps at this point in time, that there is such a small number of women in those roles, as you note.
I know that, for instance, that President Biden has appointed a large number of people of color and black women on the appellates and the district courts. Adana Brazil, who's a veteran Democratic strategist, suggested that the Democrats should remain focused on appellate judges. And I'm assuming that's because she sees this as a way to have a stepping stone then to the high court.
Absolutely. So that is definitely a place from which presidents draw their nominees to the court. Given the young age of many of the recent appointees, your guess is as good as mine insofar as when the next Supreme Court appointment may come about, but certainly populating those benches with diverse judges is important in its own right, but also, as Donna Brazil points out, important to ensure that there is a vibrant cohort of women of color and diverse judges to pick from in the future.
Now, in terms of reaction, we have actually different kinds of reaction. Senator Lindsey Graham, Republican, has said this is not an affirmative action pick. On the other hand, you have Senator Roger Wicker from Mississippi, a Republican, who claimed that this was a beneficiary of affirmative action. What do you make of these reactions and what is certainly to be a tough battle ahead in terms of this nomination, whoever it happens to be?
Sure. So, I think with any political appointment or any political process, there's going to be a backlash, and certainly President Biden has experienced that in recent days, and there has been a lot of critique of his decision. But insofar as that specific criticism that this is an affirmative action pick, I don't give that any credence at all. When you look at the qualifications of the people who appear to be on Biden's shortlist, they are nothing short of extraordinary. Their educational backgrounds, their legal careers, their community service, their commitment to public service is really nothing short of extraordinary. And I think you could hold those credentials up against any, male nominee or possible male nominee, and it would be very, very hard to see, a difference in those qualifications. And so I reject that, but I do recognize that there has been, both from the left and the right, criticism of Biden's approach. I've certainly heard that it would have been better if perhaps he hadn't made the public declaration of putting a black woman on the Supreme Court and instead had just done it. But nonetheless, there's, no shortage of incredibly qualified individuals for Biden to choose from, and I don't envy that decision.
By the way, it reminds me of Clarence Thomas, who was appointed to the Supreme Court by the first Bush president. And obviously there was not that kind of criticism at the time, at least I don't remember it. Obviously there were other issues that certainly held up his nomination. How do you compare, say, a Thomas nomination as opposed to the kind of nomination we might get today?
Well, of course, we've got two different, political parties that are, behind these different nominations. I think perhaps Thurgood Marshall cleared the way for the Thomas nomination. Again, although the two are so different ideologically, the country had seen a black man on the court. This is really an appointment of first impression. And it's, again, anytime there is an appointment of this kind, it becomes, especially today, becomes a very partisan political matter. And it's just, I think it's, similar, but also obviously very different. I think, the declaration by Biden that this was what he intended to do, perhaps has put some of the opposition, on notice even earlier, so that they could kind of work to, develop their strategies against this. But the process is so much more political today in terms of the confirmation hearing than we have seen historically. Well, I expect there will be a fight.
No doubt. Well, in terms of Clarence Thomas, there will be if this nomination goes through, there will be two African Americans on the court. One is Clarence Thomas, a black African American male. And then we'll have what seems to be certainly a younger nominee, who is an African-American woman. How do you see that dynamic playing out? Because, one obviously expects that this pick will be certainly a liberal pick, if that's the defined word that we want to use, as opposed to Thomas, who has been probably the most conservative member of the court, maybe even beyond somebody like Antonin Scalia.
Absolutely. I think that this raises an important point, and that is that, obviously a diverse bench in terms of race and gender and ethnicity is important. But I think it's also important to remember that, even if we had a court comprised of 9 black women, those women would not all be coming from the same perspective. They'd have different backgrounds and different life experiences, different educational experiences, different legal careers, and their judicial ideology is really not something that we even would know until they, step onto the court and start participating in the decision-making process. And so, diversity is certainly important, but it is also, I think, I sort of reject the idea that having 2 individuals who are black or African American on the court. You can't look at any of the people that Biden are considering and put them up against Thomas and compare them in many ways other than, perhaps the color of their skin. So, my co-author and I in this book really advocate for diversity, across an entire spectrum. It's not that it wouldn't be that interesting to have, 9 people who all came from the same exact standpoint on the court. In fact, that's not how our Supreme Court was designed. I will make an interesting note. This is not the first time that a black woman has been considered for the Supreme Court. We studied all of the women who had been shortlisted going back to the early 30s. And in our list of 9 women who presidents considered before Sandra Day O'Connor became the first, Amalia Kearse surfaced as one of the shortlisted women. She was shortlisted by presidents across political parties, across partisan divide. But of note, when the Clarence Thomas nomination appeared to be in jeopardy, after Anita Hill came forward and made accusations about sexual harassment, Amalia Kearse, one of the women who was shortlisted early on, was put forth as a possible contender for the court. And so, in some ways, I think it's important to, let your listeners and people in general know that although this appears to be the first time that we may actually end up with a black woman sitting on the Supreme Court, it's certainly not the first time that a woman has been considered.
Do you think that we have been moved on from tokenism when it comes to the Supreme Court?
Well, that's a difficult question. I mean, certainly we've transcended the time when Sandra Day O'Connor was, the only woman. There weren't even bathrooms in the court for her to be able to use.
Right.
And so, I do think that that tokenism continues to be a problem, but to the extent that we would have 4 women sitting on the court, I think that we've transcended that to some extent. Of course, there are a lot of other diverse women who, whose race or ethnicity has never been represented on the court. We've never had a Native American justice. We've never had an Asian female. And so I think we still have, a ways to go in terms of diversity, but I do think that this is an important step in sort of, letting the public know that the playing field is wide open, and there's just so many extraordinary people who could serve in that role.
Let me ask you to sort of look into the crystal ball. We will have perhaps 4 women on the Supreme Court. Do you think that gender, in terms of their experiences or maybe some of the common experiences they had, will play a role in how they approach these cases or these issues as a group, or do you think they might be influencing one another because of that gender connection, or they certainly have similar experiences of some kind? That's to be expected. I mean, what do you see the dynamics there, if you can?
Absolutely. I mean, it's interesting because there's been a lot of research that's been done on whether gender or race makes a difference in judicial decision making, and really it doesn't, except when we're talking about cases of discrimination, sexual harassment, that sort of thing. But certainly, if you look at some of the cases that the Supreme Court has decided over time, it's been clear that having women on the court has shaped the discussion, if not influenced the outcomes. So, I think of the case where there was a young teenage girl who was strip searched in her high school, and she, had ibuprofen on her because, it was that time of the month and she needed to have, pain relief medication. And Justice Ginsburg was able to educate the members of the court about, just how invasive something like that, a strip search of a teenage girl, could be, something that maybe a male member of the court really couldn't quite appreciate. I think that the women will, of course, add vibrancy and perspective to all of the debates and the discussions. Justice Ginsburg, certainly talked about how she watched some of her male colleagues change their perspective or soften or just develop an understanding after serving with her for all of those years. And so I think it's inevitable. Really, probably whoever gets appointed to the court, regardless of their race or gender, is going to bring a certain life experience that will inform the discussions and the deliberations.
One of the questions I have is, in terms of partisanship, Justice Breyer suggested or said that dissent is a failure, and he was often known as trying to reach across the aisle, walk down to his brethren's offices, conservative and liberal alike, to chat, to try to form a consensus. But given the fact that we're now in this sort of highly partisan and highly ideologically divided country, do you see that era passing us by, or do you think that there's more to be done in terms of trying to find some kind of middle ground?
Well, I'm the eternal optimist, and so I would say that it probably depends on the cases that are before the court. I think there certainly will be plenty of opportunities for that consensus, for that coming together. But of course, we are also at a time where we are facing some very, very serious and divisive issues that will, make their way, have made their way to the Supreme Court. Issues that may be very much more difficult to find that common ground. And so, there's obviously, a process in place for justices to express their discontent or their dissent. And I expect we will continue to see that, especially in some of the hot-button cases like abortion, like affirmative action. But I don't know that is a universal across every case that makes its way to the court.
Do you think those particular kinds of cases, abortion, discrimination, that kind of sexual harassment sort of thing, Do you think those would be the most highly partisan or highly ideologically, at least, divisive in terms of perhaps splitting off the conservative member on the court? I mean,
I do. I think that it's hard to say what else will find its way onto the court in the coming years, but at least right now, the affirmative action and abortion cases seem to be the ones that have the most potential for that kind of divisiveness.
I want to also mention that Lawrence Tribe, a prominent, obviously, professor of law, has described Kagan as the establishment's justice and Sotomayor as the people's justice. How do you see this nomination coming up, fitting into that category? I mean, if you indeed agree with that category.
Well, I guess we don't know who it's going to be, and so I guess time will tell. There's an extraordinary group of potential women on the list, and so I guess we will see how who this is and how they may fit in with that characterization. I'm not sure.
Well, so just turning to maybe one of them, Ketanji Jackson, who was just recently appointed to the appellate court from the district court, and she has her own familiarity with law enforcement. Her uncle, I guess, has a cocaine conviction. On the other hand, she had another uncle's Miami police chief at one point. What do you make of her, and what do you see playing out if she does become, say, for instance, a nominee?
Well, I mean, I find it's fascinating to learn about the backgrounds of the possible contenders for the court, and certainly, she is no stranger to, just her personal experience with the system, both, in all of the different capacities that you have mentioned. And I do think that our personal lives do shape our professional ones. It's, I think, impossible for it not to. So she certainly has seen things through a different lens. She's obviously quite qualified. She hasn't been on the court for a long time, although, again, that's not out of line with other appointments. I do. We talk a lot about diversity and as it relates to race and gender, but there's another form of diversity that I think really lacks on the Supreme Court. If you look at the educational pedigree of the Supreme Court justices, they are all Ivy League graduates, and there's obviously nothing wrong with that. I mean, these are the nation's leading law schools, and it would make sense that justices from the Supreme Court would come from those places in the same way that sometimes justices come from the federal appellate courts as a natural pipeline to those positions. But in talking with people about the Supreme Court and about the justices, I do hear from a lot of people who wish that there was more educational diversity. And so as we are looking critically at all of the people that Biden may pick, Judge Childs comes to mind. She went to the University of South Carolina and kind of pushes back, if you will, against that tradition of the appointment of of judges from very, very elite law schools.
Do you think that that homogeneity, as it were, both educationally, but often certainly on the conservative side, I think it's true of all coming through this process of appellate judges and district judges. Do you think that the fact that we don't have somebody that, say, for instance, may have a law degree but has not been a judge, do you think that has an impact on limiting the view of these justices? I mean, I'm thinking about Earl Warren, for example, who was a governor at one point. What do you make of that? I mean, do we, and Sandra Day O'Connor, for that matter, I think, also had some experience beyond simply the judicial.
Sure, she had some legislative experience, and Elena Kagan was not a judge. She was the dean of Harvard Law School, Solicitor General, and so from my perspective, I think that makes for a more interesting and a more diverse and a richer Supreme Court. I mean, obviously, the most directly analogous job that one could have before sitting on the Supreme Court would be sitting on a federal appellate court or a federal circuit court. But these are all of the people who are being considered for the court have very, very rich legal experience. And so while the learning curve perhaps may be a bit steeper for somebody who comes directly out of politics, like a governor or a legislator or a dean, certainly we've seen historically that learning curve is one that is quickly overcome, and certainly doesn't get in the way of them becoming fully immersed in the life of being a Supreme Court justice.
I mean, do you think that, for instance, that there might be a development of a detachment because people do come through up these judicial ranks? Obviously, as you point out, some of them have certainly personal experiences beyond that. Certainly, gender will affect that, race will affect that as well. But that it creates a detachment, and that there is a lack of sense of the implication of the kinds of decisions that they make. In other words, we're looking at the Constitution as sort of this piece of machinery without thinking about its impact down the road.
I suppose depending on the individual, that could certainly be the case. But anybody who has been through law school and has engaged in the practice of law, I think has most of us have sort of the utmost respect for the Constitution and understand just the vital importance of the decisions that the Supreme Court makes and the lasting impact. And so, even absent that qualification on the job, I think for many people that detachment, I think, wouldn't be the case. Now, of course, we're speaking in generalities, and so depending on who the nominee may be, absolutely that could be something to be concerned about.
Finally, looking ahead, obviously this is going to be a tough fight, as I guess a lot of these are. I saw a CNN quote one source to say, tactically, we know Republicans are going to throw everything they can at her and make it ugly, end quote, which indicates a tough fight ahead. And we just had some quotes earlier in the interview about that. How tough do you think this is going to be? I mean, and the Democrats only have 50 senators. What do you make of how that's going to play out? Do you think? I mean, there are only a few. I mean, actually, there are only a few senators I think crossed over, and some of the latest nominees out of the Democratic Party, for that matter.
That's right. I think it's going to be a challenge. I have every confidence that the process will work, and that we will end up with somebody on the court in short order. But I have no doubt that it will be, as you said, an ugly ride. I mean, both, and I would say both in the Senate as well as in the media. We have my co-author and I have studied extensively just the way that mainstream news has critiqued so many of these women nominees on things that have nothing to do with their qualifications. So, on the one hand, we have the political partisan fight that is inevitable and will be happening, ongoing until it's over. But then there's also the scrutiny on things based on, things that are not at all connected to her qualifications, like whether she's married, does she have kids, does she have too many kids, what is she wearing, how does she, show up. So it's going to be a challenge, whoever the nominee is, and history unfortunately kind of paints that picture pretty clearly for us.
We've been speaking with Hannah Brenner Johnson, co-author of the book Shortlisted, Women in the Shadows of the Supreme Court, and we appreciate you taking the time to talk with us this morning.
Thank you so much for having me.
This has been Delmarva Today. I'm Don Rush. Thanks for listening.
Delmarva Today with Don Rush.